Oh, good. So, I mean, I'll try to keep this as short as possible because I realize that, we've got a panel full of experts here, and I suspect they'll have a lot of interesting stuff to say. I was really grateful to read this paper because it really helped me clear up something that always like gnawed at me when I would look at the size circle in a Craver diagram. And I think the flat view is a really good way to clear up some of the worries about what exactly is going on with psi. I wanted to ask about this notion you have where the way to intervene is really to intervene on the input to the inputs and the outputs. So it seems like in most explananda, there's going to be a series of stages in the explananda. So in your car and you're starting the engine example, you could intervene by turning the key, and that runs the starter. But you could also intervene by interrupting the intake valve. You could intervene on the piston, and each of those is going to interrupt some sub-part of the phenomenon of starting the car, right? And it seems like you need that flexibility to deal with the complexity of interventions that you might make on the phenomenon. But that got me thinking to whether there were interventions on the phenomenon that wouldn't be really analyzable in terms of sort of a punctate intervention on a subpart of the explanandum. So I was just trying to think of some cases and tell me if you think it's really just not a worry at all. One case might be, let's say you're doing a decision task and you vary the speed at which someone has to make the decision. So making a decision in 1 second versus making a decision in a half a second looks like an intervention, but it's not really quite an intervention on the input of the mechanism. In attentional tasks, you could vary distractors and the number or the type of distractors over the course of a trial. In a memory task, you might vary whether someone has to also perform a visual task while trying to do a lexical memory task, for instance. So I was just trying to wrap my head around, are there interventions on the phenomenon that wouldn't be parcelable into an input of either the whole mechanism or to some part of the mechanism? And is that a worry? How do you deal with those cases?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's a really great question. I think there are a couple things. There are a couple things that I want to say here. About there being stages in the explanandum, I think that's going to bring us much closer to Beata Krickel's view on this. She wants to really emphasize the fact that S's sighing is not a static thing. It's and I do think that some of the literature gets confused by thinking of psi as something like a property at a temporal instance or something, rather than an extended process that has components and stages. The action potential rises and then peaks and then falls and then has a refractory period. I think that's very important. And part of what Beata has tried to do in her general reformulation of mutual manipulability is to spell it out so that we, in a general enough form that we could intervene on different of those stages. We could run these experiments starting at different places. And I like that idea. And part of the reason why I like that, and I'm not sure how to, so maybe psi-in is sort of too rigid a notion. We need psi earlier and psi later to handle that sort of thing. And that's maybe relevant to the other questions that you're asking. In characterizing psi, the phenomenon that you want to explain, that is to some extent up to us, where we're going to cut the boundaries of that thing. Now, the world might guide us to think certain boundaries are more natural than others. But, where does the car's starting really begin? Does it begin with your intention to start the car, with the nerve impulse going to the muscles that will turn your wrist? Does it begin when you put the key in the ignition, or only when you turn the key? Those questions, it seems to me, the world will not answer for us. And we have to make some decisions about what we're going to call the beginning and what we're going to call the end. And once we've made those decisions, we can proceed from there. Now, I also think that this term in, psi-in, and this is, I think, a really, it's making me wonder whether the language of in and out is the best way to describe it. And, Mockimer, Darden, and Craver, in that paper we we made a big stink about the fact that they're not just inputs and outputs. There are startup conditions and termination conditions. And I always thought that we were making a lot of hay about not much there. But I think your second set of questions about, if you change the speed of the decision-making task, or you vary the number of the distractors, are those, that doesn't happen at the very beginning of the experiment. So is it really psi-in if you think about these things in this very linear, beginning to end kind of way? And I think that what we really ought to do is to think about psi-in as intervening on any of the conditions, any of the background or standing conditions that are required for the mechanism to work. And then there's sort of what's out of the mechanism and what's in the mechanism. And of course, some of those boundaries are going to be drawn arbitrarily or maybe not arbitrarily, but on the whims of the person who's seeking the explanation. And then any change to things that are outside of it could constitute an intervention on S's psiing. Exactly where that intervention happens, I think we might have to break S's psiing into component parts and analyze it that way. Am I answering your question, Dan?
Yeah, and I think that's the right way to go. I mean, I guess the only follow-up I would make, and maybe I have to apologize, I haven't read Fiona's paper on this particular paper yet, but it does seem to speak to this rigidity. A lot of these problems come from these rigidity assumptions. So if you think that the mechanism just is this fixed, immutable thing, then this idea of changing the background conditions and changing the mechanism identity and changing how you divvy up the stages will seem problematic. But I also think that rigidity is a idea we should just kind of abandon. So.
Absolutely. I mean, that abandoning that rigidity is always in the back of my head. I think it's natural when you see people writing about mechanisms to think that what they think is that the world has come pre-chunked into things that are and are not part of the same mechanism. And I actually see the world as a very tightly interconnected place where there's all kinds of causal commerce going on, some of which is relevant and some of which is not. And so the act of taking our busy, buzzing confusion and turning it into a world of mechanisms is a significant intellectual achievement that involves foregrounding some things and backgrounding other things and making decisions about relevance. And relevance to what? Well, who's in charge of that? Well, we are. So what counts as in, what counts as out, I think can really shift quite a bit depending on one's perspective. And that shouldn't terrify us. It's not that the world is somehow changing. It's that our attitudes, our orientation towards the world is changing. And we just have to make sure that we're not mixing up those things.
Let me just start. I got a bunch of questions and I need to start with one. So let me just start with the question, why do you said you want to make compatible the interventionist picture and the mutual manipulation business. And that was really the project of the talk. And I wonder why the way to go must be to change the mechanistic picture of how this mutual manipulation works. You could also take the angle from the or approach the problem from the interventionist side and say, well, that's too strong. We are not just looking for causal relations. We are also looking for different relations. And if we weaken interventionism sufficiently, we can make mutual manipulation work without having to restrict ourselves to just causal betweenness. Would that also be an option that's interesting somehow? Or would you say, no, we really need to focus on just causal betweenness?
Let me be careful in how I answer this question. I prefer, first of all, I don't see this as radically changing the mechanistic picture from what it was before. I do see it as a fairly continuous clarification of the earlier view. Now, the benefit of hindsight is always 20/20, and it turns out that I always had it all worked out, and that's probably false. But nonetheless, I do see it as relatively continuous. And so in general, if I can have everything I want without changing much of anything, I would rather have that.
But you could say the same about changing interventionism, that isn't much, just committing to, you stick with the manipulationist picture and you just commit to saying it's not necessarily causal, the relations that we figure out by interventions.
Yeah, I like that picture. I think for the reason that I gave, though, for thinking that interlevel causation is weird, that and is invariably sort of, and which I think is also a reason for thinking that it will be invariably fat-handed. That's worrisome to me. I think there are just conceptual problems there that have to get worked out. And I think merely removing a constraint on the interventionist picture will introduce a set of unpleasant consequences that one might not want. But I think that we'd have to think it through. I know that people have tried, and I know that you are among them, have tried to modify the interventionist picture so that it no longer places this constraint. And my student, Mark Povich, who's doing this really exciting work on mathematical explanation, really wants a generalized counterfactual account. Whether it's spelled out in terms of manipulationism or not is a different matter, that would apply to things like mathematical relation. When I change the circumference, I change the radius, and when I change the radius, I change the circumference. And why not think of that in manipulationist terms as well? I'm okay with the thought. I guess I would prefer, for reasons having to do with my concerns about interlevel causation, to stick with the kind of solution that I've got here. Yeah. But I think you're right that one thing that the paper in its current form doesn't do, and it's in part because I haven't gone back to address your work, is to think through why this would be a better solution than one that involves changing the requirements on interventionism.
I think one of the benefits it has is that you can keep talking about causation, which with my solution you wouldn't. And if you really want to talk about causation rather than any sort of making, that's helpful. So that's the obvious benefit. Then I wonder, like the picture you gave us now with the causal betweenness, where constitutive relevance is basically causal betweenness. What then does that mean for a constituent? Is a constituent now, is it a special kind of part, or is it a stage? Because in the paper there is a passage where you also say that constituents are stages. So what's the relation between constituents and stages?
Well, this is where I think Beata's work on the temporal structure of these things is really very, very helpful. It's important to recognize that these part-whole relationships in mechanistic hierarchies they're both spatial and temporal. They're active. Things are going on in those diagrams, and the diagrams are meant to be an assistance to thought about these things, but unfortunately they introduce all sorts of unwanted suggestions about spatial composition and things. But I think part of what Beata is trying, and we need diagrams on this, but part of what Beata, and I know you've done some work on this as well, and Marie Kaiser as well, thinking about the temporal structure of mechanisms and how to represent that. I think that these pie tin diagrams that I've been trotting around talking about, these I've heard it called a flan and a pie tin, and I forget what else, Craver diagrams or whatever, these conic structures. We need something better than those, something that really captures the temporal dynamics of things.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Can I have one more question, Marco?
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I think so. I think we're at time.
Sorry?
Yeah, we're in time.
Okay, cool. So I'll go. So when we have the picture that you drew now with basically it's all down to one causal chain, and we are basically putting the input conditions, then the different components of the mechanism as they are operating, and then the output conditions. I wonder what to do about higher level causal claims or higher level causation, because I thought that was one of the major benefits of the mechanistic view, is that we can make sense of higher level causal claims. Would you just say then that if we want to have higher level causal claims, they are just causal claims that are more coarse-grained from a different perspective, sort of? Or what would be the solution there?
Yeah, exactly. They're coarse-grained causal claims. So
Okay, then I'm okay.
although the mechanisms view, I mean, I know that part of what I'm hesitant about in all of this is that when I make everything uni-level as I have here, it does appear to take back the important thing about mechanisms, which is that they're found at multiple different levels of organization. I think one thing that's happened in this dispute about mutual manipulability is that Jaegwon Kim style concerns about higher level causes have gotten mushed together with concerns about constitutive relevance in a very unhealthy and unhelpful way. I do think that there are issues about higher level causes that require answers. And my answers are so non-novel as to not be worth a lot of our time. I think that higher level causes, I mean, it's going to, ultimately I'm going to say something that will sound a lot like Stephen Yavlo and a lot like somebody who will appeal to something like multiple realization as a way of making higher level causes relevant, or identity, as the case may be, as a way of making higher level causes seem relevant. I'm not somebody who thinks that these causes compete with one another. I think there can be causes at multiple levels at once, and that's fine. And I think it's fine for me in part because I'm much closer to the kind of physicalism that a Jaegwon Kim really wanted to force people to accept. And so it's a lot easier when I say S is psiing just is a bracket over the relationship between input and output, and that it's a black boxing of those lower level details. I'm really doing, I think, exactly the kind of thing that somebody like Jaegwon Kim would want, the way he would want to think about these systems. And that means, that it's not a kind of, I don't think it's intended to be some sort of scary, have your cake and eat it too, physicalism, but take it all back kind of position. It's physicalism. But nonetheless, I think we can make sense of the fact that it's the waters being below freezing rather than above freezing that explains why it's in a chunk, rather than it's being a particular temperature in the room explaining why it's in a frozen chunk, or in addition to it's being a particular temperature that explains it's being a frozen chunk. And I think we have good reasons for making those kinds of claims.
The question, John, then just is like, how close are you to John Bickel after all?
Well, I mean, Bickel's just, I think he and I are still very temperamentally different. I'm find mechanisms at multiple different levels of organization. All of these kinds of behaviors, from the behaviors of whole organisms to the operations of their organisms, to their organs, to their cells, to their molecules, are potentially relevant contributors to the behavior of these mechanisms. They are the kinds of things for which you could do manipulationist experiments and find out that there are difference makers that are really quite abstract in this system. And I think that a science that somehow blinded itself to the importance of those higher level and in this case abstract difference makers is blinding itself to a portion of the causal structure of the world that is absolutely essential if we're going to make any progress on these difficult problems that we've got. And indeed, I think that the entire mentality of cellular molecular reductionism is though often presented as trumpeting scientific virtue, is in fact running in exactly the opposite way and taking some sort of philosophical dogmatic view that the world just is molecules or something, and insisting that science should somehow follow that philosophical dogmatic perspective. And in my view, what's missing in things like genetics at the moment, where you've got people building these genomes, doing genome sequencing and doing GWAS studies of psychiatric disorders, what's missing in that world is that they're trying to link genes to behaviors directly without anything in between them. And if you talk to the people who work in that world, they will all acknowledge that what's missing is the mechanism that connects genes to behavior. And in order to get that, you're going to have to talk about things like personality type and friendship structures and organs and all of that. So I think that Bickel is still very much an advocate for a worldview that I find counterproductive for the sciences, that will prevent us from solving the problems that we've got to solve. And it really does turn on the fact that there are, in fact, levels of mechanisms, and that we're missing something very important when we don't pay attention to them. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up on the idea that what goes on at higher levels of mechanisms is ultimately completely dispatchable in terms of lower level parts and their interactions with one another. So.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, Charles, for your nice paper and talk. I think it clarifies a lot, but it also put some more problems in my head that I trying to wrap my head around. And I think one important thing your paper highlights is where is exactly the disagreement, or at least the differences in the project where they lie. And if I understood you correctly now, what you want to say is that your account is basically an account of how to find constituents. It's primarily an answer of the epistemological project, but somehow based on the assumption that there, as you call it, is an intimacy between the phenomenon and the mechanism. So let's call it some kind of reductive supervenience, whatever that is, something like identity. And of course, both of these conditions or assumptions, I think this is exactly where other people like myself, Baumgartner, Gebhardt, Romero, and others, and also I just got accepted a paper that I wrote with Michael Baumgartner and Lorenzo Cassini. There the project is first not focusing on the epistemological part. Of course, it is connected, but it focuses on the conceptual or metaphysical part. And it assumes, it doesn't argue, but it assumes non-reductive supervenience between the phenomenon and the mechanism. And of course, only based on these assumptions, the whole problem arises. So if you say it's just an epistemological project and you assume identity or whatever, then the problems do not arise. And I think that this is why it's, I mean, somehow an easy solution. But now what my troubles are, or my questions to you, is that, I have to think about this more, but somehow I now don't see anymore or get troubles understanding how this notion of a level, the phenomenon of interlevel causation, parthood, and so on, these all seem to be tackle conceptual metaphysical issues, or at least this is how I would understand this. And then one issue would, well, if it's just about the epistemology, then all these problems, they just don't arise, so why talk about it? But then what you said at other points, you do want to make conceptual or metaphysical claims at some point about reality and the phenomenon and so on. And I just have issues then understanding of what exactly a level is, according to your view, what the phenomenon is. So sometimes what you say sounds like a version of functionalism, realizer functionalism, or role functionalism. Sometimes it doesn't sound like this. Each of these views, in my view, gets more problems with other assumptions like parthood and so on. Yeah, so I think my first basic question is, would you agree that this is the main difference? And could you maybe point me into a direction of how then the problems, which I take to be conceptual metaphysical problems, even arise?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Beata. That's really helpful. I don't intend to limit myself just to the epistemic questions. It's more that at the time that I was writing about mutual manipulability, I wanted some answer to the question, what makes a part relevant to the behavior of a mechanism as a whole? And I thought, surely this will be easy to figure out. And it turns out that it wasn't. And that the best that I could come up with at the time was a sufficient condition. I don't think at the time that I said that all I cared about was evidence. But in retrospect, when you say all I've got is a sufficient condition, that if you pass this test, and this test, then you're a component. That sounds more like an evidential claim than it does anything looking like a philosophical analysis. It's just these are things that would be sufficient to establish that something is a component. And I also at the time knew that there were other ways to be a component that would involve not satisfying those three requirements. So I knew that those three requirements were not each necessary for something to be a component. And so at some level I knew that the analysis, if it was an analysis, was not an adequate one. It was a step in the direction of what I want. But to answer your question, I want an answer to the semantic, the metaphysical, and the epistemological question. I want answers to all three of them, and I want them to mutually reinforce one another. So I think it's important that what we learn constitutive relevant, that what we take the semantic or the metaphysical answers to be should make it clear why these are the kinds of experiments that one ought to do in order to test it. That these things should be mutually reinforcing. And so merely describing a sufficient condition, mutual manipulability, for parthood should be an important clue towards the kind of thing that we want out of parthood, out of componency. But it can't be the whole story, because we know that there are things that are components that aren't, that couldn't possibly satisfy these requirements. So I really do want a unified and coherent view that takes the epistemology and the metaphysics and the semantics and gives a systematic and justifiable answer to all three of those. Now, I do think that on the levels question, I think this would dovetail with the stuff that I've done with Dave Kaplan or Gualtiero Piccinini as well, that I think my desire to play non-reductive materialist has dropped as the years go by in favor of materialist. But I still think that there are these Yablo-style arguments that do at least a first-pass decent job of saying why there are aspects of the causal structure of the world that are missed if you don't deal with abstract causes. I think that that what makes those causal claims true is ultimately particular stuff, and I'm a Glenninite when it comes to the singularism about these issues. So I don't know if I've raised more problems for you or not. But if it's the case that I think if I want to have my cake and eat it too, it's that you have levels which are ways of clumping lower level causal relations. There's a perspectival element in that because they get clumped only relative to some highest level containing system. There are causal truths that hold of abstract things that do not hold of their concrete realizers, and in that sense, I'm non-reductive about those. But I don't know if that's non-reductive enough for you. So I don't know. Have I addressed?
I think that addresses the question. I think that one important difference between my account that you so nicely referred to and yours is that I base my thinking on non-reductive physicalism. So I assume that there is no identity, and then of course then only the problems of interlevel causation and so on arise. And I think in your flat view, then of course, I mean, there is no interlevel causation because at least from the metaphysical perspective, there is just one level.
No, that's useful to know. I hadn't thought of you as being, I mean, for me, in a way, these terms like non-reductive physicalism have come to have so many different ways of understanding them that I don't any longer know what they exactly mean or whether I am one or not. But I do think that the view that I have on offer shouldn't raise these kinds of worries, or that there's a systematic philosophical worldview here that just doesn't face these challenges.
Yeah, I think one main difference is that in my view, and also what I think Michael and Alexander were doing, non-reductive physicalism makes it clear that if you model it in an interventionist framework, you have to model the phenomenon, and whatever the error between the phenomena and the components are, at least if you ignore time, cannot be a causal error. And if you assume identity, I mean, you could still use the different variables, but in some way it does not make sense, because then you use two variables to represent one and the same thing. And if you are non-reductive physicalist, there is a reason to use both variables. And I think that then gives you the problems.
I see. By the way, I think that there's a fourth issue here, and Alex is probably the person who's most in touch with this issue. There is a huge question about how to model all of this. Yeah. And I think that the Gleamore world, the CMU, UDaPearl modeling world, which I don't follow closely as I used to, it seems to me that they have not dealt with the problem of levels directly. And then the question is, what would be the right way to represent these different variables in such a model, so that you could still crank the same algorithms? And so I think that's, in a way, a fourth dimension. What's the right way to model this stuff so that all of the Bayes-Netz literature can actually apply to it? I do not take that one on. I've been, I take myself to be the qualitative handmaiden to the CMU types, that I want to spell out sort of a world picture, a qualitative world picture, and then say, whatever your algorithms do, they should reveal this to us. And then you guys figure out how to get your machines to do that. I'm just telling you what the science looks like.
I agree. Can I ask one final question?
Well,
Yeah.
we can try to do this later, so we can have time for a second round, probably. Sorry.
Let me just say about this handmaiden comment that, I mean, I don't think that I'm just merely describing what scientists do, but rather part of what we're doing in conversations like this is to place some constraints on what an adequate formalism would possibly have to honor. And so I see this as preparatory work for the kind of hard-nosed modeling stuff that people who are better at that kind of thing could do someday. And if we can shape the project up in a way that makes it amenable to that kind of modeling, that would be, for me, just a tremendous victory for this.
So, you know, I'm extremely sympathetic to the approach you're taking, in part because I'm sometimes a little bit puzzled about what the problem is and why it needs a solution. You know, because I'm sort of the sort of Aristotelian approach about sort of the right degree of precision for the right project, and I sometimes worry that there's the appearance of a problem here has to do with trying to make the mutual manipulability idea more precise than it needs to be for what we're trying to do here. But given that we are trying to make it precise, then I have questions about how it's been made precise, right? So I'm in particular looking at 2 slides in a row that you had, the rewriting mutual manipulability and then the cases where experiments fail us slides. So the criteria, CR1, I, and E, and CR2 star. Yeah, you're almost there. Yep. Thank you. So the first 2 say when, and the third one says if. And you say that these are sufficient conditions for evidence. It's evidential, right? So it's an epistemic for concluding that you're dealing with a part-whole relationship, a constitutive relationship, mechanistic constitutive relationship.
Concluding that the part is relevant.
Right. So
the parthood, the constitutive stuff, by the way, I wasn't clear about this in the verbal presentation, but there's just an assumption to make. There are similar kinds of experiments that will work for causation.
Right.
and so there has to be a stipulation before this that we're talking about something that's spatiotemporally contained within, or something like that.
Yes. Okay. So this is what I'm pushing on a little bit, actually, with the next slide as well. So I take it that it's not the case that these are independently necessary and mutually sufficient. Rather, it's if you can, as with the Woodwardian model of testing for causal relevance, the idea is the when and the if are existential. If there's an intervention that has this result, then that's a reason to think that you've got a cause. So it doesn't have to be that one intervention both inhibits and stimulates and et cetera, right? It's a different I in each of the three criteria, right? You're doing different things. There are different interventions here, and if any one of them works, then you have evidence of mechanistic relevance, constitutive relevance. Is that correct?
No. No. I intended it to be the case that the three of them together, if you satisfy all three of them, that's sufficient. I suppose that I would say that each, if you satisfy each of them individually, that would nudge up, your posterior probability that the thing was relevant. But you could have something that satisfies. The way that I typically go through this is to say you could have something that, you knock out this brain part and the organism is now, somnambulant in the bottom of its cage. And you say, oh, look, it's the sleep-wake center. But in fact, you've just, taken out its spinal column or something.
Right.
And so you could have an inhibitory experiment. That wouldn't be evidence that it's part of the sleep-wake system at all. And so, or it would be evidence. It would be evidence. It would increase the probability that it was part of the sleep-wake system, but it wouldn't be. Yeah.
Well, so if I look up at, I guess now I'm going to look at the previous slide of your interlevel experiments re-envisioned. Sometimes you're intervening on C, and sometimes you're intervening on psi in. So it's not the same intervention. You're not intervening on the same spot in CR, I, E, and 2. Yeah, so the previous picture. Right, it's not one thing that does all of that.
Yeah, so that's what's going on in this thing on the left. I think if I understand where you're coming from, Tom, it wouldn't be enough for me to show that C is a cause of psi out and that in is a cause of C, right? Under some intervention. I need some way to say that what psi in does to C is precisely what my intervention on C did that produced psi out.
Right.
Sorry, I should be pointing with this. That my intervention, when I produce this change in C, it should be that if I were to induce that very change here, that it produces psi out. But you could imagine an awful, foiling situation where there's some way of wiggling this that wiggles this, and there's some way of wiggling this that wiggles that. But these two wigglings are not the same, and then you end up. Is that the problem that you're pointing at, Tom?
Well, now I'm not sure.
Okay.
So the first thing I'm pointing out is I think that I'm asking, I guess, whether it's the same where the existential quantifier goes in your rewritten criteria. Is there an existential at the beginning of each one, so that there could potentially be different I's, or when you're quantifying and you're saying there is an I, is it the same I in all three?
It can't be the same I in all three.
Right, so that's way too strong, right, for it to be the same I in all three.
Yeah.
So in that case, there are different interventions, right? There's some intervention that inhibits and some intervention that stimulates and some intervention that allows you to change values in the top-down way, right?
That's exactly right.
So and those are different interventions. So you do want to say there has to be, in order for there to be constitutive relevance, there has to be some intervention that does each of those things, and they're different interventions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So now, I want to understand your concern on the next slide that there could be undriven or unchanging components. Because, of course, there could be components like the flywheel that are, or better yet, the axle that the flywheel spins on, that don't change. But yes, indeed, there is still, I mean, it should still satisfy your criteria, right? There is some intervention that would cause, if you change that axle by greasing it or breaking it, you could inhibit or stimulate or change the rate of rotation and so forth. That's not the normal thing that goes on in the mechanism, but it seems like it would, unchanging and undriven components would still satisfy your criteria as stated.
Well, what it would do, so let's take the cylindrical nature of the axle, and let's call that C. Now, suppose that I intervene to make it cylindrical. Well, I'm probably not going to be able to drive the behavior of the car just by hammering on the axle, right? And if I start the car, that doesn't make the thing become cylindrical.
Right.
But it is the case that if I were to, that's here. If I start the car, that doesn't make the axle become cylindrical. So it's not changing that feature of the component. So these experiments, 1 and 3 just won't apply in that case. It is the case, though, that when I start the car and run it, and if I were to change the axle from cylindrical to some sort of rectangularity, that's going to cause some problems for us. And so this experiment works, but the other two, it's hard to see how they would apply. I guess that's what I meant when I said for a component like that, we're going to need a different story about why it's an Innes condition.
So I think there's potentially 2 different ideas getting tangled up here.
Okay.
And I think maybe this is part of what Beata and Lena are pushing on you on as well, regarding to what extent your view ends up being a flat view or a one-level view. So the thing about undriven and unchanging components is that they aren't intuitively between.
Yeah.
Because one end is missing, usually the starting end. But so the undriven component isn't between psi in and psi out because it's not part of the normal causal chain. And the unchanging component in it is not intuitively between them either, right? But despite not being intuitively between them, they actually do satisfy your rewritten criteria, because the rewritten criteria just requires that there be some intervention on them that would make a certain change. And surely there is some. It's just not one. It's not a change that happens in the normal operation of the mechanism qua mechanism. But if we're just testing for constitutive relevance, then we can discover that it's constitutively relevant. I mean, it's like, I think, right, thinking about the axle that the gear spins on is a good one, right? So we think about the position of the gear as being what's mechanistically relevant. If you think of and this is relevant to your point, sorry to use relevant in that way, but this is germane to your point about, well, it's us who impose the mechanistic structures, right? So we could think about the gear as including the axle or spindle that it spins on, or we could think, but if we think of those as separate components, then it looks like the spindle or axle is unchanging, or in some sense, I wrote a different word down here at some point, but it looks like it might not be part of it, but of course that was our decision to envision it in that way, and there are interventions on it, and so it can satisfy this.
I think what you're saying, so just to make sure, I mean, I think that what you're saying now sounds very congenial. Actually,
it's meant to.
Yeah. I would hope that, first of all, part of what I'm hearing is that this caveat over here on the left needs to get explicitly worked into these mutual manipulability criteria. That's
Maybe
part
so.
of. Part of what I'm hearing is that hasn't happened yet, and that you're exactly right that needs to happen. Part of what I'm hearing is that there are possible solutions to these problems that don't take us very far away from where we already are, and it will partly involve like thinking about undriven components or unchanging components in a slightly, thinking about the contours of the mechanism differently. So if you've got some undriven component that is one that psi in, you could think of that as just another input to the mechanism.
Right.
That's another way of conceiving what's going on here, and I think that would be a perfectly adequate way to try to handle what's going on with undriven components.
Good. So right. So what I'm suggesting is what makes undriven and unchanging components seem problematic is that they're not intuitively between, but intuitive betweenness is a gloss of your idea, not the full presentation of it. Now, the flip side of that is that there are other components, there are other things that you can do that would satisfy one or more of these criteria that are not intuitively part of the mechanism at all, but satisfy those criteria, right? Some of the background conditions and other things. And so one thing you could do is bite the bullet and say, yes, when we include those variables and we consider them in this way, they are part of the mechanism. So, so conceptualized. And so, when you think about, the oxygen in the room, that becomes part of the lighter mechanism, because without the presence of oxygen, the lighter doesn't produce the flame or whatever, right? So background conditions, other such things. But I wonder if that's what you want to say there, whether you want to accept those as parts of the mechanism, or whether you would prefer to, as you were sort of getting at earlier, maybe require all of these things or some interaction in a way that would allow background conditions.
I think rather than try to answer exactly how I would want to handle these cases, I mean, background conditions have given me fits for years. I would love there to be an objective base, as would everyone.
Yeah.
We would. It's not just the mechanists, but almost anyone engaged in any debate. I'm thinking of Ken Waters, for example, about why are genes different than environments? And he wants to make a case that they are, and then he's got an actual difference-making story that will explain how that works. And I'm much more temperamentally inclined to the world will not make this decision for us kind of attitude. Now, what I've done in the past is to give a long list of things, a background condition, and Woodward does this as well. Because background conditions will satisfy the manipulationist test. You take the oxygen out of the air, the lighter doesn't work anymore. And I guess I'm inclined to say that we could expand the boundaries of the mechanism out so that it includes the oxygen if we wanted to. I guess I'm inclined to go in that direction. But I'm disinclined here off the cuff to try to give answers of that sort to these two outstanding problems. What I do agree in what you're doing here is to say, the trick is to find a truth maker for the claim that undriven components and unchanging components are part of the mechanism nonetheless, without at the same time opening the floodgates to all of the flotsam and jetsam that these experimental methods were designed to eliminate in the first place. That is exactly, as far as I can see it, that is exactly the philosophical problem here.
Okay, thanks so much. I really don't have many critical comments here because Carl and I both agree that this is like the best account of constitutive relevance currently on offer. I've been working on a paper arguing for this account as well. So my comments are really just ways that Carl might develop his paper. Okay. So I'll start with just like a big picture question, namely, what exactly is the goal of this project? As I see it, there are three different things you might be doing here, and I'd like to hear which one of these, if any, you take yourself to be doing. Okay. So the first thing you might be doing is presenting a solution to the problem that the mutual manipulability account faces. The second thing you might be doing is presenting an interpretation of your previous work that doesn't face MM's problem in the first place. Okay, and the third thing you might be doing is presenting what you take to be the only legitimate interpretation of your previous work, which so happens to not face MM's problem in the first place. Okay, so I don't think that you're doing the final thing because in the paper and in your presentation, you did present the original criteria of MM, right? And you showed how they didn't work in the way that Baumgartner and Gebhardt said. Okay, so you seem to be saying that it's not the case that we've all been just like misattributing MM to you. Okay, so the question then is whether you're giving a solution to MM's problem or giving an interpretation of your work that doesn't face MM's problem.
I mean, so let me just answer that directly. Like I said in my apology at the beginning, I do worry that that the tone of the paper comes off as, look, I've always had this all figured out, and why doesn't anyone understand that I've always had this all figured out? And I do think that I do think that there are passages in the original work that suggest that I was both aware of the fact that Woodward's manipulationism, that suggests the fact that I was aware that Woodward's manipulationism fit uncomfortably with interlevel relevance claims, and an attempt to respond to that by specifying how I expected these interventions to work, and that I did have some detailed discussion of the fact that what we were really doing when we did a top-down intervention was intervening on the input conditions to the mechanism as a whole. But I don't think that any of this, my focus at the time was on developing an account of, well, first of what the problem of constitutive relevance was, and then trying to put some constraints on an adequate solution to that. I was not especially focused on Kim-style worries about exclusion or the incompatibility of Woodward. And to me, this is something that really has arisen partly through the work of Bert Luridan and Baumgartner and Cassini, and among others, who pushed me on this over the years. So no, I mean, what I would prefer this paper to be, with you hopefully, is a mature statement of a solution to a kind of incompatibility that makes sense in a systemic context. That there's a world picture that comes with an epistemology, and that those things fit together in a relatively tidy way. And whether that all got worked out in 2007, I don't really give a damn. And I think one thing that's perfectly clear is that what I thought I was attempting to say was not clearly communicated, and so that at least that's the case. And so there's a need for some reformulation. And as Tom's questions just suggested to me, the revised version needs some reformulation as well. I don't expect. I don't think we're done with this problem yet, and I think it requires more work. But in general, what I want is a solution to this apparent incompatibility and a world picture that's safe for mechanisms at multiple levels and interventions.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, like, one of the things that I really like about this particular account is that it's consistent with like almost everything that you say about mechanisms, right? The only thing we're changing is our explicit account of constitutive relevance, right? So the only thing it's inconsistent with then is your explicit statements of MM in your earlier work, right? This account doesn't like cause us to rethink interlevel experiments very much, or interlevel causation, or like the nature of constitutive relevance, right? It's just a really minor tweak that fits with the rest of your work, and so retains all of the benefits of your work, I think.
I think Emily, you're underselling the value of what you've done. So I mean, I appreciate what you're trying to say, which is that this isn't a great admission that things have to be fixed, and the whole thing has to be gutted and gut rehabbed. But rather, it's a relatively minor adjustment. But I don't think I would put it that way. And I think working with you has really helped me to see that that's the case, and the work that you've done to try to hammer out exactly what mutual manipulability would look like if you thought through this way of understanding the interventions was carried through properly. And I think that once one's done that, one gets a much richer, when I was putting these slides together, I thought, wow, this is a really rich and systematic view of how the mechanistic structure of the world and these epistemic strategies fit together and work. And it's really economical for saying when these experiments fail, when they succeed, and then when we start considering these cases that Tom and I were just talking about, like undriven parts and that sort of thing, it provides a framework within which you might attack those. So I think that the stuff that you've been doing to try to make this all explicit, which I'm hoping to benefit from even more than I have already, it will in fact be a significant improvement to the way that this stuff is getting laid out. Not in a way that fundamentally undoes the view, but in a way that really makes it much better and tightens the bolts quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds great.
Thank you very much for the talk, Carl. I think I'm the only one who has a question this week, but what I wanted to push you on, and you given that you know that Jackie is here, you might be able to anticipate some of this, but I'm worried about the comments you had on the slide immediately previous, where you talk about it having to be, when we're doing interventions, we want those interventions to be on exactly the same type of C, whether those interventions involve inhibition, stimulation, or changing the value of C. But my worry with your condition on it saying that they have to be the same C gives up a lot of the robustness when you have sort of variability within your experimental techniques where you're using sort of a very similar experimental paradigm that isn't identical to a previously deployed experimental paradigm. So what you get are sort of, or ideally what one would hope to get is the kind of robust triangulation where you have a bunch of different experiments that are all poking C-ish types of things differently, and that are all revealing different sorts of responses to pokings of C-ish type things that would reveal something more broad about the kind of phenomena that all of these different experiments are working on, such that there might be something that we do cluster together as a higher level phenomenon, despite the fact that there is some variation among the phenomena that each of these individual experiments deals with. And so the strong condition you put on the fact that it has to be the same type of C, I see the point for that, and insofar as that being the most robust type of epistemic evidence for it being exactly that, C being a component relevant to the mechanism seems great, but I worry that sort of puts too hard of a constraint on the kind of robustness we want to get out of our experimental practices, that having kind of a wider range gives us a better handle on the kinds of things we see outside of a laboratory that we take to be phenomena of interest.
Yeah, I get the point. Sorry, were you done?
Yes, that. So the question is, how hard do you want to push on it being the same C? Like, how bold, underlined, and emphasized do we need to make it the same C to satisfy you, and if so, and would so doing cause us further problems down the line?
Well, I mean, so I think there is some importance to making sure that the C's line up with one another here, because there's some way that, you know, like I could intervene on cyan and produce a change in C, but that change that's produced in C would not itself produce the change in psi out. And before I was using terms like overlap or, and I think I need some, even if it's not the precisely same values, what I need is that the changes that psi-in produces in C are precisely the kinds of changes by which C produces the change in psi-out. That's what I need. And now imagine that there are 20 different techniques for studying the value of C. And what I get is a robustness about what C is doing during these different experimental protocols. That's okay, I think. You know, if we're thinking about like LTP, which is almost certainly, if you're thinking with Jackie about this, the kind of case that you would be interested in, I think it's worth remarking that, you know, suppose that I engage the animal in some sort of task and I see some change in the synapse, and then suppose that I go in with some totally artificial stimulus and drive C, and it's utterly unlike what happens during the normal learning situation in psi, you know, down here. But now I go in and I do something to C that's utterly unlike what happens to C in the normal in the normal course of events. Then I don't think I want to say that C is relevant to this transition in the normal course of events. So it's precisely the kind of worries that Jackie would have that make me add this caveat off to the left.
Okay, all right. So we're not so much worried about the ecological validity. I
am. I'm very much interested in that. Again, I mean, let's think about a top-down activation experiment where I engage some rat, or I engage a plesia in some sensitization task, and then I see a change in the synapse, right? Now I want to know, is that change that I observed in the synapse actually responsible for the sensitization response? Well, suppose that I go in and I make that without you know, shocking thing. I go in and I just change the synapse directly and I get that behavior. That's an argument that in fact the change that was induced there is relevant to the sensitization response. But if I'm changing C in two different ways there, one by changing psi-in and one by changing C directly, then I haven't really tested whether this chain is complete. And that's, I know I'm not being very clear or precise in articulating what I want, but I hope that I'm at least gesturing.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.